I walked into my sister's engagement party already knowing I didn't belong there, not because I didn't love her, and not because I didn't want to celebrate. I knew it because the room told me before anyone spoke. The lights were warm and flattering, the kind meant to make everyone look successful. Glasses clinked. Laughter floated easily, confident and loud. Everyone looked like they had rehearsed for this moment. Everyone except me. I was standing near the entrance when I felt someone step too close behind me. A man's voice, low and amused, brushed against my ear. "You really shouldn't have come," he whispered, his smile cruel even though I hadn't seen it yet. Poor people ruin the photos. I didn't turn around. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I stood still, my fingers tightening around my clutch, my chest going strangely quiet. No one else heard him. No one stepped in. The cameras kept flashing. The music didn't stop. What no one in that room knew was that they were standing inside a property I owned. What he didn't know was that the woman he had just humiliated was the sole owner of the company leasing this venue and several others like it. And what I knew, standing there in silence, was that if I spoke now, it wouldn't matter, not yet. I learned a long time ago that timing is everything. I stepped aside, letting another group squeeze past me toward the photo area, and took a breath by the tall windows overlooking the courtyard. From here I could see my parents near the bar, smiling and chatting with people they clearly liked more than they'd ever liked silence. My sister was at the center of it all, glowing, laughing, exactly where she'd always belonged. The humiliation didn't hit me like a slap. It landed like something familiar, like muscle memory. That was what scared me most. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even angry. I was tired. I had felt invisible in rooms like this my entire life. The dress I was wearing wasn't expensive. I'd bought it a few days earlier at a department store after landing late from a work trip. It fit well enough, but it didn't sparkle. I hadn't styled my hair beyond brushing it back. I hadn't worn jewelry that would catch the light. I'd come as myself, the version of me that didn't try to explain anything. That version had never been enough for my family. People brushed past me without noticing. A few glanced at me, their eyes flicking down and then away. One of my aunts gave me a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Someone I didn't recognize asked me who I was waiting for, then lost interest halfway through my answer. I leaned against the window and watched my sister pose for photos with her fiancé. He stood tall, confident, his arms secure around her waist. The same man who had leaned in close enough to make sure his insult landed where it hurt. He laughed easily now, like someone who had never been told no. I wondered how many times in his life he'd decided someone's worth within seconds. I wondered how often he'd been right. The truth was, nothing about this moment surprised me. Not the whisper, not the laughter behind my back, not the way no one noticed when I stepped out of the frame. This was simply the latest version of a story that had started long before this party, long before my sister's engagement, long before I had learned how to build something that couldn't be taken away from me. I hadn't always known how to be quiet like this. I hadn't always known how to stand still while someone tried to shrink me. I learned it slowly, over years of being compared, corrected, and dismissed. Growing up, there had always been one daughter who shined brighter, and one who learned how to step out of the light. My parents weren't cruel people. That was the hardest part to explain. They provided. They showed up. They loved us in the ways they understood. But love, when paired with constant comparison, can still teach you that your place is somewhere on the edge. My sister had always been easy to love. She smiled easily, made friends effortlessly, knew how to fill a room. Teachers remembered her. Neighbors asked about her. My parents talked about her achievements like they were shared victories. I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who was always fine. When relatives asked how I was doing, my parents would say, "She's good. She keeps to herself." As if that explained everything. At family dinners, my sister's stories took up most of the table. When I spoke, it was usually to answer a question that had already been asked twice. When I had opinions, they were often met with, "That's nice, but," followed by someone else's idea. It wasn't malicious. It was habitual. Over time, I learned to stop offering things that weren't wanted. I learned that being low maintenance made people comfortable. I learned that if I didn't ask for attention, no one would resent me for taking it. Standing at the engagement party window, I could feel all of that settling into place again. The role fit too easily. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne. I took a glass I didn't want, just to give my hand something to do. The bubbles rose quickly, bright and fleeting. I watched them disappear and thought about how strange it was that people could celebrate permanence with something that vanished so fast. The venue itself was beautiful. I'd approved the final renovation plans 2 years earlier. I'd argued for the lighting near the windows, insisted on the flooring that now gleamed under everyone's shoes. I knew where every emergency exit was. I knew which corners still needed better soundproofing. No one here knew that. They saw only a woman standing alone, dressed simply, not quite fitting the picture. That was fine. A group gathered near me, laughing loudly. One of them glanced at me and lowered her voice. Not quite enough. "I didn't know she was coming," she said. "I thought this was going to be more curated." Someone else chuckled. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. I had heard versions of that sentence my entire life. I thought about leaving then, slipping out quietly, the way I always had. No one would have stopped me. No one would have asked where I was going. But I stayed. Not because I wanted to prove anything, not because I was waiting for revenge. I stayed because I wanted to see how far this would go when I let people show me exactly who they were. Across the room, my sister caught my eye for a brief second. There was a flicker of something there. Guilt, maybe, or discomfort. Then someone called her name, and she turned away, smiling again, her attention already elsewhere. I didn't blame her. She had learned a different set of rules than I had. I checked my phone, more out of habit than need. A message from my assistant sat unread, a reminder about a meeting the next morning, about decisions that actually mattered. I locked the screen and slipped the phone back into my bag. Tonight wasn't about that life. Tonight was about this one, the one that had shaped me before I ever learned how to escape it. I finished the champagne and set the glass down untouched by anyone else. As I straightened, I noticed a man near the entrance, scanning the room in a way that felt familiar. He wasn't dressed like the others, no forced confidence, no performative laughter. His eyes moved carefully, professionally. For just a moment, our gazes met. There was recognition there, not the kind that comes from shared blood or obligation, but the kind that comes from shared work, from rooms where decisions are made quietly and consequences are real. I looked away before he could approach. Not yet. The music swelled again, pulling attention back to the center of the room. Applause broke out as someone tapped a glass. The party moved on, eager to celebrate, eager to forget the people standing just outside the frame. I took one last look around. The laughter, the whispers, the assumptions. They thought they knew who I was. They always had. And for a long time, I let them believe it. I had felt that silence before, long before anyone ever whispered about photos or money. Standing by the window at my sister's engagement party, watching people laugh without me, didn't shock me. It confirmed something I had known since I was a child. In my family, there was always a place for me, but it was never at the center. I grew up in a perfectly normal American household, the kind people described as loving and stable. There were dinners together, holidays spent under the same roof, and parents who worked hard and believed they were doing the right thing. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. From the inside, there was a pattern no one ever named. My sister was easy to love. She had a way of drawing people in without trying. Teachers praised her enthusiasm. Neighbors commented on her smile. Friends followed her wherever she went. My parents spoke about her future like it was already guaranteed, something bright and inevitable. I was different. Not difficult, just quieter. I liked to observe before speaking. I preferred reading to crowds, planning to improvising. I learned early that the less noise I made, the easier things felt for everyone else. At first, the comparisons were subtle. My parents would say things like, "Your sister just has such a natural confidence," or "You know how she is with people." It was never said with malice. It was said like an explanation, a simple statement of fact. Over time, those facts began to feel like instructions. When relatives visited, they asked my sister about her friends, her plans, her dreams. When they turned to me, it was usually to ask how school was going, then nod politely before redirecting the conversation. I learned to keep my answers short. I learned not to interrupt the flow. At dinner, my sister told stories that filled the table. People leaned in when she spoke. Laughter followed her words naturally. When I tried to contribute, someone often spoke over me, not rudely, just without noticing. Eventually, I stopped trying. I wasn't invisible. I was convenient. I did well in school. I followed rules. I handled responsibilities without being asked. When something needed to be done quietly and correctly, it was usually handed to me. My parents trusted me, but trust and admiration are not the same thing. Trust meant they didn't worry about me. Admiration meant they didn't think about me much at all. There were moments that should have mattered more than they did. Birthdays that passed with simple cards and practical gifts. Achievements acknowledged with a brief smile before attention shifted back to my sister's latest milestone. None of it was dramatic enough to confront. That was the problem. Once, during my teenage years, I brought up the idea of moving away for college. Not far, just far enough to feel like my own person. My father nodded and said, "That could be good for you." My mother added, "As long as you're realistic." No one asked what I wanted to study. No one asked why the idea mattered to me. The conversation ended there, as if my future had been sufficiently discussed. I started keeping more things to myself after that. Not out of spite, but out of instinct. I noticed that when I shared plans, they were met with concern instead of curiosity. When I shared dreams, they were gently reshaped into something smaller, safer, so I stopped sharing. By the time I was 17, my sister and I lived in the same house but occupied different worlds. She came home with stories, energy, and friends trailing behind her. I came home with lists in my head, things that needed to be done, ways to stay out of the way. My parents didn't mean to make me feel like an afterthought. They simply responded to what was loud and easy. I learned early that if I wanted peace, I had to become background noise. Looking back, I understand now why the whisper at the engagement party didn't break me. It fit too neatly into the narrative I had grown up with. The idea that I didn't belong in certain spaces had been planted years ago, watered slowly by indifference and comparison. There was one moment, though, that I still think about often. It was small, almost forgettable, but it clarified everything. I was in my final year of high school, sitting at the kitchen table with paperwork spread out in front of me. Applications, part-time job schedules, notes about expenses. I had been saving quietly, working weekends and evenings, building something I didn't yet have the words for. My sister walked in, excited about a new opportunity, her voice filling the room. My parents listened, engaged immediately, asking questions, offering suggestions. I waited until the conversation slowed before mentioning that I was considering moving out after graduation, finding work in a nearby city. My mother looked at me for a moment, surprised. "That seems like a lot," she said. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" I nodded. I had never been more sure of anything. My father glanced at the papers in front of me and said, "You know you don't have to rush. You can stay here until you figure things out." Figure things out, as if I hadn't been doing that all along. I realized then that they didn't see me as someone capable of building something new. They saw me as someone who needed to be protected from failure. It wasn't cruelty. It was limitation disguised as care. That night, I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of a house that had never quite felt like mine. I understood something important in that quiet. If I stayed, I would continue to be defined by other people's expectations. If I left, I would at least have the chance to define myself. I didn't announce my decision dramatically. I didn't demand understanding. I simply began to prepare. Over the next year, I worked more hours. I saved aggressively. I researched places to live, jobs to apply for, ways to survive without a safety net I didn't truly have. My parents noticed, vaguely. They commented on how responsible I was, how independent I had become. They still didn't ask why. When I finally told them I was leaving at 19, the reaction was calm. Too calm. My mother asked if I had enough money. My father reminded me to be careful. My sister hugged me distractedly, already thinking about something else. No one asked what I hoped to become. That should have hurt more than it did. By then, I had learned that disappointment was easier to manage when you expected it. Standing at the engagement party years later, watching my sister shine in a room full of people who adored her, I didn't feel jealous. I felt distant, like someone observing a life that had branched away from mine long ago. The whisper about ruining photos wasn't an attack on a stranger. It was an echo, a reinforcement of the idea that I was meant to stay on the edges, to be grateful for inclusion rather than expecting respect. I watched my parents laugh with guests, proud and relaxed. I watched my sister lean into her fiancé, confident and adored. I watched myself reflected faintly in the glass, a woman who had learned how to disappear without ever truly leaving. What none of them understood was that my silence had never meant weakness. It meant preparation. I hadn't left my family because I hated them. I left because staying required me to keep shrinking. And somewhere between being overlooked and being underestimated, I had learned how to survive on my own terms. By the time I walked away at 19, I wasn't running from anything. I was walking toward the only future that made sense to me. I left home on a quiet morning when the house was still half asleep. There was no dramatic goodbye, no last-minute speeches about staying in touch. My suitcase sat by the door, lighter than it should have been, filled with clothes I'd worn too many times, and books I wasn't ready to part with. I stood there for a moment, listening to the familiar hum of a place I had outgrown long before I learned how to name it. My parents were in the kitchen when I walked in. My mother was already dressed for work, my father scanning the news on his phone. They looked up when they heard my footsteps, both of them pausing as if they had forgotten this was happening today. "So this is it," my mother said, not unkindly. I nodded. "Yeah, I'm heading out now." She asked if I had enough money. I told her I did. My father reminded me to be careful, to call if I needed anything. The words were familiar, well-worn, like lines repeated out of habit rather than urgency. No one asked where I was scared. No one asked what I hoped would happen next. My sister came down the stairs halfway through the exchange, hair still messy, phone already in her hand. She hugged me quickly, distracted, and said, "Text me when you get there." Then she smiled and disappeared back into her world. That was it. I carried my suitcase out the door myself. No one followed me to the driveway. No one stood waving from the porch. I didn't expect them to. I had already learned that my departures didn't register the same way my sister's entrances did. The car ride away felt strange, like stepping out of a room where the air had slowly been thinning without me realizing it. With every mile, my chest loosened just a little. Not because I was happy, but because I was finally moving in a direction that belonged to me. The city I moved to wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a dream destination. It was simply affordable, close enough to find work, far enough to feel anonymous. I rented a small room in an old building with thin walls and neighbors I barely knew. The window faced an alley. The heat worked when it felt like it. The mattress sagged in the middle. It was perfect. For the first time in my life, no one knew who my sister was. No one compared me to anyone else. No one expected me to fit into a role I hadn't chosen. I was just another young woman trying to figure things out, and there was a quiet relief in that. I found work quickly, not because it was easy, but because I wasn't picky. I waited tables in the evenings, cleaned offices early in the morning, and picked up weekend shifts wherever I could. My days blurred together into a cycle of work, sleep, and planning. I learned how much groceries cost when you bought them yourself. I learned how quickly rent was due again. I learned that exhaustion felt different when it was tied to your own survival instead of someone else's expectations. There were nights I came home so tired my hands shook as I unlocked the door. Nights I ate standing up because sitting down felt like surrender. Nights I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I was making a terrible mistake. But there was something steady beneath the fear. A sense that every choice I made now was mine alone. If I failed, it would be on my terms. If I succeeded, no one could take credit for it. I didn't tell my parents how hard it was. When they called, they asked if I was doing okay. I said I was fine. It wasn't a lie. It was just incomplete. I wasn't thriving yet, but I was learning. I started saving without any grand plan attached to it. A few dollars here, a little more there. I tracked every expense. Not because I was obsessed with money, but because money represented options. Options meant freedom. I noticed things differently once I was on my own. I paid attention to neighborhoods, to buildings that looked neglected but structurally sound. I noticed how some streets felt like they were waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what I was looking for yet, only that I didn't want to spend my life renting space in someone else's future. There was a particular afternoon I remember clearly. I had just finished a long shift and was walking back to my place, passing rows of houses that all looked slightly tired. One of them had a small sign out front. For sale. The paint was peeling. The yard was overgrown. Most people would have kept walking. I slowed down. I didn't go inside. I didn't call the number. I just stood there for a moment, imagining what it might look like cleaned up, cared for. It wasn't a dream. It was a question. What if I didn't just survive here? What if I built something? I pushed the thought away at first. It felt ridiculous. I was 19, working multiple jobs, barely sleeping. Owning anything seemed far beyond my reach. But the idea didn't leave me. It followed me home, sat quietly in the back of my mind while I counted tips and folded laundry. No one knew I was thinking this way. I didn't mention it to friends. I certainly didn't mention it to my family. I had learned that some ideas were better protected by silence. My days settled into a rhythm. Work, save, observe. I didn't spend money on things that didn't move me forward. I didn't chase distractions. I wasn't building a life that looked exciting from the outside. I was building one that felt stable on the inside. There were moments of loneliness. I won't pretend otherwise. Watching other people my age go out, take trips, live lightly while I counted pennies wasn't easy. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself why I had left. I hadn't left to be admired. I had left to be free. The city didn't care about my family history. My coworkers didn't know my role at the dinner table growing up. Landlords didn't compare me to anyone else when rent was due. Responsibility was blunt and honest in a way I appreciated. I grew stronger without noticing, not in loud ways, in quiet ones. I learned how to negotiate my schedule, how to say no to things I couldn't afford, how to plan months ahead instead of days. When my parents asked if I planned to move back home eventually, I said I didn't know. The truth was, I knew exactly what I didn't want. I didn't want to go back to a place where my growth would be measured against someone else's comfort. Leaving hadn't made me brave. It had made me honest. There was a night, about a year after I moved out, when I sat alone in my small room with a notebook open on my lap. I had been tracking my savings, adding up small numbers that didn't look impressive on their own. But together they told a different story. I realized then that I wasn't just getting by. I was laying a foundation. I closed the notebook and looked around the room. The chipped paint, the borrowed furniture, the view of the alley below. None of it mattered as much as the fact that I had gotten here by myself. I thought about my family, about how they might picture my life now. Probably as temporary, probably as something I would grow out of. I didn't feel angry about that. I felt resolved. They didn't need to understand what I was doing. They didn't need to approve. I wasn't building this life for them. As I lay down to sleep that night, exhaustion heavy but satisfying, I understood something that would guide every decision I made afterward. I had left with nothing but pride, and that had been enough to begin. Everything else would come later. I didn't start looking for a house because I felt ready. I started because I was tired of paying for a life that never quite belonged to me. Rent kept going up. Landlords changed rules without warning. Every month felt like a reminder that nothing around me was permanent. I was walking home from work one afternoon when I noticed a small sign leaning crookedly in front of a house I had passed dozens of times before. For sale. The letters were faded, almost apologetic. The yard was overgrown, the porch sagging slightly on one side. Most people probably saw a problem and kept moving. I stopped. The house wasn't beautiful. The paint was peeling in wide strips, exposing older colors underneath. The windows were dusty, one of them cracked. The front steps creaked when I put my weight on them. It looked forgotten, ignored. I recognized the feeling. I didn't go inside that day. I didn't call the number. I stood there longer than necessary, taking it in, trying to understand why my pulse had quickened. It wasn't excitement, it was recognition. Beneath the neglect, the structure was solid. The roofline was straight. The foundation, from what I could see, hadn't shifted. It had good bones. That phrase stayed with me as I walked away. Good bones. It sounded like something people said about potential they didn't know what to do with yet. Over the next few weeks, I found myself taking the long way home just to pass that house again. Sometimes I paused, sometimes I didn't, but I always looked. I started noticing other houses like it, tucked into streets that felt on the edge of change. I noticed which neighborhoods were getting new coffee shops, which ones were suddenly busier on weekends. I wasn't dreaming, I was studying. When I finally called the number on the sign, my hand shook slightly. The woman on the other end sounded tired. She told me the house had been on the market for a while. Too much work, most buyers said. Too many unknowns. I understood that language. It was the same one people had used about me my entire life. The first time I walked inside, the smell hit me immediately. Dust, dampness, something old and stale. The floors were scratched, the walls stained in places where water had leaked. The kitchen cabinets hung unevenly, their hinges rusted. There was no elegance here, no charm yet. But I could see it. I could see clean lines where clutter had been. Light where grime blocked it now. I could imagine what it would feel like to stand in a space I had repaired with my own hands. I didn't tell anyone what I was thinking. Not my parents, not my sister. Not even the few acquaintances I had made in the city. I had learned the cost of sharing plans too early. People heard uncertainty and responded with doubt. I didn't need that. Instead, I did math. I went home and spread out my notebooks. Savings, income, expenses, numbers I knew by heart. I looked at loan options I barely qualified for. I looked at worst-case scenarios. What if I lost a job? What if repairs cost more than expected? What if no one wanted to rent from me? Every scenario ended the same way. It would be hard, but not impossible. When I mentioned the idea casually to a coworker, she laughed, not cruelly, just surprised. "You're thinking of buying a house? By yourself?" I nodded. She shook her head. "That's risky. You're young. You should wait until you're more stable." More stable. The word felt hollow. I had been stable my entire life. Stable enough to carry weight that wasn't mine. Stable enough to be overlooked. I didn't ask for advice after that. The day I signed the papers, the real estate office was quiet. The agent seemed mildly confused by my presence, as if expecting someone older, louder, more confident. I didn't fill the room with excitement. I asked careful questions. I read everything twice. When I signed my name, there was no rush of triumph, no dramatic sense of arrival, just a steady awareness that something irreversible had happened. The house was mine. I moved in immediately, not because it was comfortable, but because I couldn't afford not to. There was no hot water for the first week. The heating system worked sporadically, choosing its own schedule. I learned quickly which outlets were unreliable, which doors stuck in humid weather. During the day, I worked my regular jobs. At night, I became someone else entirely. I watched videos on repairs. I read manuals I barely understood. I learned how to strip paint, how to patch drywall, how to tell when a problem was cosmetic and when it was structural. My hands were constantly sore. My clothes smelled like dust and sweat. I went to sleep most nights too tired to think. But something was different now. Every improvement, no matter how small, stayed. Every hour I spent working didn't disappear into someone else's asset. It accumulated. I fixed the worst of the leaks first, then the floors. I painted one room at a time, careful not to rush. I found cheap fixtures at salvage stores, learned to see value where others saw junk. Slowly, the house began to change. So did I. There were moments I questioned myself. Standing in the cold shower, water barely warm, I wondered if I had made a mistake. Lying awake at night, listening to unfamiliar creaks, I wondered if I had taken on more than I could handle. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of something simple. I had chosen this. No one had pushed me. No one had convinced me. This wasn't a life I had fallen into. It was a life I was building. When my parents asked how things were going, I told them I was busy. When my sister asked where I was living, I said I had found a place. They didn't ask for details. I didn't offer them. I wasn't hiding. I was protecting something fragile. After several months, the house looked different enough that people began to notice. Neighbors commented on the fresh paint, the cleared yard. One asked if I was planning to sell. I shook my head. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. The idea of renting came slowly. At first, it was just a thought, a way to offset costs, a way to breathe a little easier. I researched tenant laws, leases, expectations. I didn't rush. When I finally listed a room, my hands didn't shake this time. I had learned the value of patience. The first person who moved in was quiet, respectful. The rent covered a significant portion of my expenses. For the first time since I'd left home, I felt something shift inside me. The house was working with me. I kept my lifestyle the same. No celebrations, no upgrades. Every extra dollar went back into repairs or savings. I documented everything. I tracked progress. I treated this not as a dream, but as a system. Some nights, after finishing work, I sat on the front steps and looked at what I had created so far. It wasn't impressive by most standards. It wasn't something you bragged about, but it was solid, real. I thought about the girl I had been at 19, leaving home with a suitcase and quiet resolve. I thought about how little faith anyone had placed in me back then. I didn't feel angry about it anymore. I felt grateful. Being underestimated had given me room to move without interference. By the time the house was fully functional, it no longer looked like something people avoided. It looked like somewhere someone could live comfortably, somewhere stable, somewhere cared for. Standing in the doorway one evening, paint still drying in the hallway, I understood something clearly for the first time. I hadn't just bought a house. I had bought myself a future that didn't require anyone's approval, and once you build something like that, quietly and deliberately, it changes the way you see everything that comes next. The house stopped feeling like a gamble the day the first rent payment cleared. I remember staring at my bank app longer than necessary, refreshing it twice just to make sure it was real. The number wasn't impressive by anyone else's standards, but it meant something to me. It meant the house was no longer just shelter. It was working. At first, I told myself that was all I wanted. If the rent could cover utilities and a portion of the mortgage, that would be enough. I wasn't trying to get rich. I was trying to breathe. The tenant was quiet, respectful, paid on time. We crossed paths occasionally in the kitchen, exchanged polite hellos, and went back to our lives. I learned quickly that being a landlord wasn't about power. It was about responsibility. When something broke, I fixed it. When there was confusion, I clarified it. I wasn't collecting money for nothing. I was maintaining a system. That word stayed with me, system. The rent came in every month, steady and predictable. It didn't fluctuate with my mood or my energy levels. It didn't care if I was tired or overwhelmed. It showed up quietly, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. I didn't celebrate. I didn't change my spending. I didn't tell anyone. I opened a separate account and put every dollar of rental income into it. I treated it like it didn't exist. Instead, I started writing things down. Expenses, repairs, timelines. I tracked how long it took to fix issues, how much each improvement cost, what actually mattered to tenants and what didn't. I learned that fresh paint mattered more than fancy fixtures, that clean, functional spaces mattered more than trends. I wasn't following advice from gurus or books. I was learning from reality. The house taught me patience. It taught me how small decisions compounded over time. Every improvement made the next one easier. Every problem solved made the next one less intimidating. I began to notice something else too. The anxiety I'd lived with for years started to loosen its grip. Not disappear, but soften. There was comfort in knowing that if I lost a job, I wouldn't lose everything. That one asset had given me a margin I'd never had before. I didn't feel rich. I felt secure. That feeling changed the way I walked through the world. I stood straighter. I spoke more deliberately. Not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I trusted myself a little more each day. When people asked how I was doing, I still said I was fine. It wasn't deflection anymore. It was simply true. A few months later, I started noticing other properties more intentionally, not obsessively, casually. I paid attention to listings that sat untouched, houses that were priced just low enough to scare people away. I recognized the pattern now. Too much work, not worth the hassle, risky. I didn't rush to buy anything. I didn't even plan to, I just watched. On my commute, I took different routes. I noticed which neighborhoods were being talked about differently, which ones were suddenly busier on weekends. I read local development news. I learned how zoning worked, how long permits took, how long people were willing to wait before they gave up. I wasn't dreaming of scale, I was learning context. At night, after work, I'd sit at the small table in the dining area. I had refinished myself and review my notes. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. I didn't feel lonely there. I felt focused. My family still didn't know anything about this. When my parents called, they asked about work. I told them it was steady. When my sister mentioned her plans, I listened. No one asked how I was living now. No one asked if I needed anything. That used to hurt. Now it felt like freedom. I realized something important during one of those calls. Their lack of interest meant they couldn't interfere. They couldn't question my choices or offer advice shaped by their assumptions. My silence had become a shield. The second house entered my life quietly. No dramatic moment, no rush of adrenaline. It was another listing that had been sitting too long. Smaller than my first, less charm, more issues. But the numbers made sense, barely. I walked through it once, then again. I didn't fall in love with it. I evaluated it. This time I knew what I was looking at. I knew which problems were manageable and which ones were deal breakers. I knew how much time I was willing to give. I knew what I could fix myself and what required help. When I made the offer, I felt calm. No shaking hands, no doubt spirals, just a quiet confidence built on experience. The second purchase didn't change my life overnight. It complicated it. More responsibility, more planning, more work. But it followed the same system. Buy low, repair intentionally, rent to people who respected the space. I didn't upgrade my lifestyle. I didn't tell friends. I didn't change my routines. If anything, I became more disciplined. The two houses began to operate like gears in the same machine. One covered itself. The other moved slowly toward stability. I watched the accounts carefully, adjusting when necessary, never assuming things would just work out. There were months when unexpected expenses wiped out what I thought was progress. There were nights I lay awake calculating worst-case scenarios again. But this time, fear didn't paralyze me. It informed me. I was building something that required consistency, not luck. Sometimes I caught myself thinking about how my family might react if they knew. The image never lasted long. I wasn't hiding from them. I was simply not offering something they hadn't earned the right to question. I visited home once during this period. Just a short trip. The house looked the same. The conversations followed the same patterns. My sister talked about her life. My parents listened. When it was my turn, the questions were brief. "Work still okay?" "Yeah," I said. "Busy." They nodded, satisfied. No follow-up. I realized then that I could live an entirely different life, and it wouldn't disrupt the version of me they held in their minds. That realization was strangely calming. Back home, I stood between my two properties one evening, keys in hand, the sky darkening above me. There was no one there to witness it. No one to congratulate me, no one to tell me I was doing well. I didn't need them. What I felt in that moment wasn't pride, it was alignment. For the first time, the effort I put into my life matched the direction it was going. I started thinking less about proving myself and more about sustainability, about what kind of life I wanted 10 years from now, about how many moving parts I could realistically manage without losing myself. I wasn't chasing scale, I was designing stability. That night, I sat alone in the quiet house and realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel wealthy, I didn't even feel particularly successful, I felt safe. And after a lifetime of being overlooked, underestimated, and quietly managed by other people's expectations, safety felt like the greatest luxury I could imagine. It was enough to know that what I was building didn't need to be seen to be real. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was standing in the hallway of my second property, holding a clipboard and listening to a contractor explain why a repair would take longer than promised. I stepped into an empty room to answer, already bracing myself for the familiar tone. "Claire," my mother said, warm but distant. "I wanted to make sure you got the invitation." I glanced at the email notification I hadn't opened yet. I knew what it was before she said it. My sister's engagement, the date, the location, a family milestone I was expected to attend simply because that was what daughters did. "Yes," I said, "I saw it." "We're very excited," she continued. "It's going to be a lovely evening. Very nice place. You'll like it." I thanked her, listened while she filled the silence with details about catering and guest lists, and waited for the part that never came. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I could make it. She didn't ask what my schedule looked like. The invitation wasn't a question, it was a notification. After we hung up, I stood alone in the quiet room and let the weight of it settle. I hadn't been home in a while, long enough that my life no longer felt connected to that place in any real way. The thought of going back filled me with a familiar tightness, not fear exactly, but fatigue. I could have declined. I had more than enough reasons. Work was busy, travel was inconvenient. Emotionally, I was in a place where reopening old dynamics felt unnecessary. I stared at the blank wall for a moment, imagining the relief of staying where I was. But I said yes. Not because I felt obligated, not because I wanted approval. I said yes because part of me wanted to see what it would feel like to walk back into that world as someone they no longer understood. The drive home took longer than I remembered. Familiar exits blurred past, each one triggering a memory I didn't linger on. I wasn't returning as the girl who had left with a suitcase and quiet resolve. I was returning as someone else entirely, even if no one there knew it yet. I arrived the night before the engagement party. My parents' house looked exactly the same. Same paint, same porch light, same sense that time moved differently there. My mother hugged me tightly when I walked in, commenting on how thin I looked. My father asked about the drive. My sister was out, busy with last-minute plans. Dinner was polite, comfortable, predictable. They asked about my job, the same way they always had. "Still working in property stuff?" my father asked vaguely. "Yes," I said. "Still busy." "That's good," my mother said. "Stability is important." I nodded. No one asked what that stability looked like. No one asked what I managed or owned or built. The conversation drifted easily back to my sister's wedding plans, her fiancé's family, how exciting it all was. I listened and smiled and felt strangely detached, like I was watching a familiar play from a seat far enough back that the dialogue no longer pulled me in. Later that night, alone in my old bedroom, I unpacked slowly. The room felt smaller than I remembered. The walls still held traces of a version of me that felt distant now. I sat on the edge of the bed and took a breath. This place had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. The morning of the engagement party arrived bright and clear. I woke early, not out of excitement but habit. I dressed simply, choosing comfort over impact. I wasn't there to be noticed. I wasn't there to explain anything. I was there to observe. At breakfast, my sister swept into the kitchen, energized and distracted. She hugged me quickly, thanked me for coming, and launched into a list of things she still needed to do. I congratulated her, genuinely. She looked happy. That mattered. Her fiancé arrived shortly after. He was confident, well-spoken, the kind of man who filled space easily. He shook my hand firmly, asked what I did for work, and nodded politely at my answer. There was a flicker of something in his eyes when I didn't elaborate. Curiosity, maybe. Or judgment. Either way, he moved on quickly. The venue was a short drive away. When we pulled in, I recognized it immediately. The angle of the building, the landscaping choices, the way the light hit the entrance just right in the afternoon. I had approved those details. My parents admired the place openly, commenting on how elegant it felt. My sister gushed about the photos they would get here. Her fiancé talked about how impressed his family had been. I said nothing. Walking through the space felt surreal. I knew where the floors creaked, where the acoustics softened voices. I knew which corners had been the hardest to renovate. I moved through it like a guest, even though every detail whispered familiarity. No one noticed. Guests began to arrive, filling the room with energy and expectation. I stood slightly apart, watching interactions unfold. Relatives I hadn't seen in years greeted me politely, then drifted away. Conversations flowed around me, rarely landing. I didn't feel offended. I felt confirmed. My sister moved through the crowd effortlessly, introducing people, laughing, posing for photos. She looked exactly like the version of her everyone had always adored. I was genuinely happy for her. I just knew my role hadn't changed. As the room grew louder, I found myself near the windows again, the same instinct guiding me there. It was easier to breathe on the edges, easier to see. I overheard fragments of conversation as people passed, comments about appearances, about success, about who belonged where. None of it was directed at me directly, not yet. My parents waved at me from across the room, smiling, proud. I waved back. We shared a moment of mutual politeness and nothing more. I thought about how many times in my life I had tried to bridge this gap, to step closer, to be more visible, and how exhausting that effort had been. Now, standing in a place I owned but didn't claim, surrounded by people who didn't see me, I felt oddly calm. I had nothing to prove here. The engagement party moved forward exactly as planned. Toasts were made, laughter rose and fell, cameras flashed, the evening settled into its rhythm. And still, no one asked me anything new. I watched my sister lean into her fiancé, watched him hold court with ease. I noticed how he scanned the room, how his eyes assessed people quickly, confidently. I wondered what conclusions he had already drawn. The thought didn't upset me. It intrigued me. As the party continued, I realized something quietly important. Coming back hadn't reopened old wounds the way I'd feared. It had clarified them. I could see the patterns clearly now without emotion clouding them. This wasn't about love or neglect. It was about familiarity. About roles that had been set so long ago no one questioned them anymore. I was the quiet one, the self-sufficient one, the one who didn't need much. They had no reason to look closer. Standing there, unnoticed and unbothered, I understood that whatever happened next would say far more about them than it ever could about me. And as the lights warmed and the music swelled, I sensed that something was about to shift. Not because I planned it, not because I wanted it, but because truth has a way of surfacing when people are too busy performing to see it coming. I stepped fully into the room just as the music shifted and people began clustering closer together, drawn toward the center where my sister and her fiancé were posing for another round of photos. The air felt warmer now, heavier with perfume, champagne, and expectation. This was the part of the evening everyone remembered. This was when impressions hardened. No one was looking for me. I stood near the edge of the crowd, smoothing my dress once out of habit, then stopping myself. The fabric was clean, simple, unremarkable. It did exactly what it needed to do. So did I. A group of relatives passed behind me, their voices just low enough that they thought they were being discreet. I didn't realize she'd be here, one of them said. Another laughed softly. Well, she is family, I guess. The word family landed oddly, like a technicality rather than a bond. I didn't turn around. I had learned long ago that confronting whispers only gave them more weight. Instead, I watched the reflection in the glass as people shifted and rearranged themselves, carefully angling toward better lighting, better company. A woman I barely recognized smiled at me politely and asked, "So, are you visiting for long?" "Just a few days," I said. She nodded, already glancing past me. "That's nice." The conversation ended before it began. I moved a little closer to the wall, instinctively giving people space. It wasn't submission, it was efficiency. I knew how to exist without disrupting the picture. My sister laughed loudly near the center of the room, her head tilted just right as cameras flashed. She looked radiant, completely at ease. Her fiancé stood beside her, confident, relaxed, enjoying the attention. He looked like someone who had never questioned whether he belonged. I wondered when he had first decided I didn't. As if summoned by the thought, he broke away from the photo cluster and began weaving through the crowd. His eyes scanned faces quickly, assessing, categorizing. When they landed on me, they paused for half a second too long. He smiled. It was polite on the surface, practiced. He stepped closer, close enough that his presence registered as intentional. I turned to face him, matching his smile out of reflex more than warmth. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked. "Yes," I said. It wasn't a lie. I was observing. That counted as enjoyment for me. He nodded, his gaze flicking briefly to my dress, then back to my face. The look was quick, but it wasn't subtle. I had seen it before. A calculation disguised as curiosity. He leaned in slightly, as if sharing something amusing. His voice dropped, casual and confident, the way people speak when they assume agreement. "You know," he said softly, "you really shouldn't have come." I felt the shift before the words fully landed. The space around us seemed to tighten, the noise of the room dulling just a little. I didn't respond. He smiled wider, mistaking my silence for confusion. He leaned closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, expensive and deliberate. "Poor people ruin the photos," he whispered, his tone almost playful, like he was letting me in on a harmless secret. For a moment I thought I might have misheard him, not because the words were unclear, but because they were so unnecessary, so casually cruel, that my mind resisted accepting them. But I had heard him. I felt my fingers curl slightly at my side, nails pressing into my palm. My chest went very still, not tight, just quiet, like everything inside me had paused to take note. He pulled back, satisfied, already looking past me toward someone more interesting. The exchange, for him, was over. Around us, laughter continued. Glasses clinked. Someone called out for another photo. No one had noticed. No one had intervened. The moment existed only between us, sealed by his certainty that it would stay that way. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, watching his back as he rejoined my sister. He slipped his arm around her easily, whispering something that made her laugh. She leaned into him, unaware. I didn't feel the urge to cry. I didn't feel the urge to shout. What I felt was something colder and far more familiar. Recognition. This wasn't about photos. It wasn't even about money. It was about permission. He had decided in a single glance that I didn't deserve space in his picture, and he had felt entitled to tell me so. I stepped away before anyone could see my face change. I didn't rush. I didn't push through people dramatically. I simply moved, letting the crowd close behind me as if I had never been there. Near the windows, the air felt cooler. I rested my hand lightly against the glass and focused on my breathing, slow and controlled. Outside, the courtyard lights glowed softly, indifferent to what was happening inside. I thought about how many times I had been reduced to an inconvenience, a background element, something to be managed rather than respected. I thought about how easily people showed their character when they believed there would be no consequences. Behind me, I heard someone laugh again, A high, bright sound. It felt disconnected from me now, like noise from another room. I glanced at my reflection in the glass. I looked calm, composed, exactly as I wanted to look. No one would guess what had just been said to me. No one would guess how deliberate my stillness was. I didn't leave. That was the part I was most proud of. I stayed because I refused to let someone else decide where I belonged. I stayed because walking away immediately would have felt like confirmation of his judgment. I stayed because I didn't need to explain myself to anyone in that room. I simply needed to watch. As the evening continued, I noticed small shifts. Conversations stopping when I approached. People glancing at me, then away. It wasn't overt. It was instinctive, like they sensed I didn't fit the tone they were trying to maintain. One of my aunts brushed past me and smiled thinly. "You're very brave to come alone," she said, as if it were a compliment. I nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "Not everyone is comfortable in places like this." I let the implication sit between us. "Comfort grows with time," I said. She didn't know what to do with that. She excused herself quickly. My parents caught my eye from across the room again. My mother lifted her glass in a small gesture, smiling. I smiled back. The distance between us felt larger than the room itself. I wondered briefly what they would think if they knew what had just been said to me. Then I realized it didn't matter. They hadn't noticed my discomfort for years. Why would they notice it now? I watched my sister move through the crowd, radiant and busy. She looked happy. I held on to that. Whatever else this night became, it wasn't her fault. She had grown up in a world that rewarded her presence. She didn't know what it felt like to be quietly erased. The man who had whispered to me laughed again, louder this time. He looked relaxed, confident that he had handled a minor annoyance appropriately. I wondered how often he spoke to people that way, how often no one corrected him. I wondered how many people swallowed comments like that every day because it was easier than making a scene. The thought settled heavily in my chest. I turned back toward the window, giving myself one more moment, not to recover, to decide. I knew, with absolute clarity, that this was not the moment to speak, not the moment to reveal anything. If I did, it would sound like defense, like justification, like I was asking to be taken seriously. I didn't ask for that anymore. Behind me, footsteps approached, slower, more deliberate than the others. I didn't turn right away. I didn't need to. I recognized the cadence. When I finally looked, I saw a man standing a few feet away, his expression shifting from surprise to recognition. His eyes softened slightly, his posture straightening with something that looked like respect. "Claire?" he said carefully, as if testing the name. I met his gaze and gave a small nod. For just a second, the room around us seemed to pause. The laughter felt farther away. The music dulled. He smiled, genuine this time, and took a step closer. I didn't know it yet, but the cruelty whispered behind my back had just reached its expiration date. Not because I planned revenge, not because I raised my voice, but because someone else had finally seen me clearly. And once that happens, the laughter never sounds the same again. The room didn't actually go quiet all at once. It happened in pieces. A laugh cut short near the bar. A conversation fading mid-sentence. The music still played, but softer somehow, as if it sensed it was no longer the main thing people were listening to. The man standing in front of me took another step closer, careful not to intrude, but clearly intent on speaking. He wore no obvious markers of wealth, no need to advertise anything. His confidence came from familiarity with rooms like this, from knowing he belonged wherever decisions were made. "I thought that was you," he said, his voice warm with recognition. I almost didn't believe it. "It's been a while," I replied. He smiled, nodding, as if mentally catching up on time we hadn't spoken aloud. "Too long. I didn't expect to see you here tonight." Before I could answer, he extended his hand, not to me, but slightly outward, as if unconsciously signaling our exchange was not a private one. I'm glad I caught you, he said. I wanted to talk to you about the Lakeshore expansion. We've finalized the numbers, and I think you'll be pleased. The words hung in the air, unfamiliar and out of place among talk of hors d'oeuvres and wedding colors. A woman standing nearby froze mid-sip. Someone else tilted their head slightly, listening now. I nodded. We can talk tomorrow, I said calmly. Tonight isn't the right setting. He chuckled softly. Of course, you always were practical. The way he said it carried history. Respect earned, not assumed. Behind him, I saw movement. My sister's fiancé had turned toward us, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to something sharper. He stepped closer, clearly trying to place the man who was suddenly commanding attention without asking for it. I didn't realize you were coming tonight, the man continued, his tone easy. When I saw the guest list, your name wasn't on it. Then again, you've never needed formal invitations. That line landed harder than anything else he had said. Someone whispered, "Who is that?" just loud enough for others to hear. The man followed my gaze, noticing the small circle forming around us. His brow furrowed slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "Oh," he said, glancing between me and the room. "I suppose I should introduce you properly." I didn't stop him. I didn't encourage him either. I simply stood there. "This is Claire," he said clearly. "She's the owner of this property, and several others you might recognize if you've been paying attention to the hospitality scene over the past decade." The sentence moved through the room like a slow wave. At first there was disbelief, a few nervous laughs, quickly silenced. Then the realization began to spread, uneven and awkward, as people replayed earlier moments in their heads. The cameras lowered. Glasses hovered uncertainly in hands that no longer knew where to rest. My sister's fiancé went pale. He stared at me openly now, his earlier confidence draining away as recognition replaced it. I could almost see the memory of his whisper replaying in his mind, the words reframing themselves with brutal clarity. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. My sister stood frozen beside him, her smile faltering as she looked between us. "What?" she asked quietly, the word barely audible over the sudden hush. The man beside me seemed to sense the tension he had created. "Yes," he said, gently but firmly. "Claire owns the venue. She also owns the management company that operates it. She's been leading the redevelopment projects personally." Someone near the back murmured, "I had no idea." Another voice whispered, "She doesn't look like—" The sentence died unfinished. I felt eyes on me from every direction now, not curious eyes, calculating ones. People were reassessing everything they thought they knew, scrambling to rebuild their understanding of the room they were standing in. My parents stood rigid near the bar. My mother's hand had tightened around her glass, her knuckles white. My father looked like he was trying to reconcile two versions of me that refused to align. My sister's fiancé took a hesitant step toward me. "Claire," he said, his voice strained. "I didn't realize, we didn't know you were—" I met his gaze calmly. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "You didn't ask," I said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact." The man beside me cleared his throat softly. "I'll let you catch up," he said to me, offering a small, respectful nod. "We'll talk soon." "Of course," I replied. As he walked away, the space he left behind felt larger, more exposed. Without him there, the room seemed to realize all at once what had just happened. Conversations resumed, but they were different now. Lower, careful. People avoided my eyes or stared too long, unsure which reaction was safer. A woman who had ignored me earlier approached suddenly, smiling too brightly. "Claire, right. I had no idea you were the owner. This place is absolutely stunning." "Thank you," I said. She waited for more. Praise, gratitude. Something that would ease her discomfort. Nothing came. She drifted away, unsettled. My parents finally approached, their steps hesitant. "Claire," my mother said softly, "why didn't you tell us?" I looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her. "You never asked," I said again, gently this time. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. Whatever he had planned to say didn't survive contact with the truth. My sister stood a few feet away, her eyes glossy, her hands twisting together. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear I didn't." "I know," I said, and I meant it. Her fiancé hovered beside her, visibly uncomfortable, his earlier swagger completely gone. He didn't speak again. Not to me. Around us, the engagement party continued in name only. The energy had shifted permanently. The easy laughter was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of embarrassment and restraint. People were no longer sure how to treat me. They didn't know which version of me applied now. The quiet sister, the invisible guest, or the owner of the building beneath their feet. I didn't correct them. I didn't clarify. I excused myself a few minutes later, slipping out of the central space and toward the side corridor. No one stopped me. No one followed. In the quieter hallway, I leaned briefly against the wall, not from weakness, but from release. The truth had surfaced on its own terms, without my intervention, exactly as it should have. I hadn't planned to reveal anything that night. I hadn't rehearsed speeches or imagined reactions. But standing there, I realized something important. Revelations don't feel triumphant when they happen. They feel strangely empty, like watching people catch up to a version of you that has existed for years without them. I straightened, adjusted my dress, and took a breath. When I returned to the main room, people noticed. They couldn't help it now. But their attention felt hollow, late. They didn't laugh anymore. They didn't whisper either. They simply didn't know how to look at me now. And in that uncertainty, I felt something I hadn't expected. Freedom. Because once people see the truth, even imperfectly, they lose the power to define you. And that, I had learned, was the quietest kind of victory of all. The silence that followed the revelation didn't feel dramatic. It felt awkward, heavy, like a room where someone had turned the lights on too suddenly, and everyone needed a moment to adjust their eyes. People didn't rush toward me. They didn't rush away either. They hovered in that uncomfortable middle space, pretending to be busy with their drinks, their phones, the table settings. Conversations resumed, but cautiously, as if everyone was afraid of saying the wrong thing now. I stood near the edge of the room, exactly where I had been before. Except now the air around me had changed. Before, I was invisible. Now, I was unavoidable. A couple I didn't recognize whispered to each other and glanced in my direction. One of them nodded slowly, like a puzzle piece had just fallen into place. Someone else laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny, trying to reclaim the mood from earlier in the night. It didn't work. The easy joy had drained out of the room, replaced by a tension no one knew how to name. People kept smiling, but the smiles were stiff now, rehearsed. The party continued because it had to, not because anyone felt like celebrating anymore. I caught sight of my parents standing together near the bar. My mother kept smoothing the front of her jacket, a nervous habit she only had when something unsettled her deeply. My father stared into his glass, not drinking, just holding it as if it anchored him to the floor. They hadn't come over yet. I wasn't surprised. Across the room, my sister's fiancé stood rigid beside her, his body language completely different from earlier. The confident lean was gone. His shoulders were tight, his jaw clenched. He laughed when someone spoke to him, but the sound came out wrong, forced. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked toward me, then away, like he was afraid of what might happen if we made eye contact again. I didn't look back. I felt no urge to confront him. The words he'd whispered earlier had already done their damage, not to me, but to the image he had been so careful to maintain. Now that the power dynamic had flipped, he didn't know how to stand inside it. That was his problem. A woman approached me hesitantly, holding a half-empty glass of champagne. She smiled, wide and uncertain. Claire, she said, as if testing the name. I just wanted to say, this place is incredible. You must be so proud. Thank you, I replied. She lingered, waiting for something else. Validation, maybe, gratitude, permission to feel better about herself. When it didn't come, her smile faltered. Well, she said quickly, congratulations to your sister. It's a beautiful night. Yes, I said. It is. She nodded and walked away, clearly unsettled by the interaction. I watched her go, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of quiet curiosity. This was what happened when people realized too late that they had misjudged someone. They scrambled to correct the record without ever addressing the mistake itself. Nearby, two relatives who had barely acknowledged me earlier suddenly found reasons to stand closer. One of them complimented my dress. Another asked how long I'd been involved in hospitality. The questions felt rushed, transactional, as if gathering information might restore balance. I answered politely. Briefly, I didn't expand. I didn't invite them in. Respect, born out of fear, didn't interest me. My sister finally made her way toward me when the music dipped into a softer background hum. Her face was pale, her expression tight with emotion she hadn't sorted through yet. Claire, she said quietly, can we talk? I nodded and followed her a few steps away from the crowd, toward the same windows where I had stood earlier. I didn't know, she said immediately, the words tumbling out. About the venue, about any of it, I swear. I know, I said. She swallowed. Why didn't you ever tell us? I studied her face, really studied it. There was no malice there, no calculation, just confusion and something close to shame. There was never a moment when it felt like you wanted to know, I said gently. She flinched, as if the truth had struck closer than she expected. That's not fair, she said softly. I'm not blaming you, I replied. I'm just explaining. She looked away, toward the center of the room where her fiancé stood speaking with someone, his posture still stiff. He didn't know either, she said defensively. About you, I mean. I met her gaze again. That's not what matters. She waited, uncertain. What matters, I continued, is how he chose to speak to me when he thought it wouldn't cost him anything. Her eyes widened slightly. What do you mean? I hesitated. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to shift her happiness onto my pain. This night was already heavy enough. He said something inappropriate, I said finally. Earlier. Her face drained of color. What did he say? I shook my head. That's between me and him. She searched my face, realization dawning slowly. Is that why everything feels like this now? Yes, I said. She closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, fighting tears. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I never meant for you to feel... I know, I said again. And I did. She hadn't meant to hurt me, but intention didn't erase impact. It never had. We stood there in silence for a moment, the sounds of the party drifting around us like something distant and unreal. Finally, she reached out and squeezed my hand. I hope you'll stay, she said quietly, at least for a little while. I considered it. Then I shook my head. I think I'm going to head out soon. Disappointment flickered across her face, but she nodded. Okay. When I turned back toward the room, my parents were finally approaching. My mother spoke first. Claire, she said, her voice unsteady, why didn't you tell us? The question hung between us, familiar and loaded. I exhaled slowly. You never asked, I said. Not once. My father frowned, clearly struggling. That's not true. We asked how work was going. Yes, I said, and I answered. My mother's eyes filled with tears. We would have been proud of you, she said. The words landed oddly. Too late, too conditional. I didn't need pride, I replied. I needed curiosity. Neither of them spoke after that. We stood there, surrounded by a room full of people who suddenly didn't know what to say to any of us. The distance that had always existed between me and my family was finally visible to everyone else, and it was uncomfortable. After a few more minutes, I excused myself. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't say goodbye to everyone. I simply slipped away, the same way I always had. Outside, the night air was cool and grounding. I took a deep breath and felt my shoulders relax for the first time all evening. The building behind me glowed warmly, still beautiful, still functional, still mine. I walked toward my car without looking back. Later that night, alone, I replayed the evening in my mind. Not the whisper, not the reveal, but the looks on people's faces afterward, the confusion, the recalibration, the quiet shame. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Being seen like that, suddenly and incompletely, had left me feeling exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had lived comfortably in anonymity for years. Stepping out of it, even unintentionally, came with a cost. The phone buzzed with messages I didn't answer. Apologies, questions, awkward attempts at reconnection. I let them sit. What struck me most wasn't the cruelty of what had been said to me. It was how quickly people changed once they realized they had misjudged me, how easily respect followed money, status, ownership. It confirmed something I had suspected for a long time. Most people don't regret their behavior. They regret being wrong about who you were. I went to bed that night with the window cracked open, listening to the distant sounds of the city. My mind felt clearer than it had in days. They had finally seen me. But somehow being seen like that felt lonelier than being ignored. And as sleep slowly claimed me, I knew one thing for certain. The hardest part wasn't over yet, because now that the truth was out, I would have to decide what came next. Morning came quietly, without the weight of the night before. I woke before my alarm, the room still dim, my thoughts already clear in a way they hadn't been in years. There was no rush of anger, no replaying of words, just a steady awareness that something fundamental had shifted. My phone lay on the nightstand, screen dark but heavy with expectation. I didn't reach for it right away. I sat up, feet on the floor, and let the silence settle. For the first time since the engagement party, the noise of other people's reactions felt distant, manageable. When I finally checked my phone, the messages were exactly what I expected. Missed calls, texts that started with apologies and ended with uncertainty. My sister had called twice. My mother had left a voicemail. Even a few relatives I hadn't spoken to in years had found my number. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I showered, dressed, and made coffee like it was any other day. The ritual grounded me. It reminded me that my life hadn't actually been disrupted. Only their perception of it had. The first call I did answer came mid-morning. My sister's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated, then picked up. "Claire," she said immediately, her voice tight. "I'm so sorry about last night. I didn't sleep at all." "I know," I said calmly. There was a pause, then a rush of words. "I should have noticed. I should have asked more questions. I never imagined." "I know," I said again. She took a breath. "Can we talk? Really talk?" I looked out the window at the street below, people moving through their mornings unaware that anything had changed for me. "Not today," I said gently. Her silence stretched. "Are you upset with me?" "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm just being careful." "Careful about what?" "About what I let back in," I replied. She didn't argue. That surprised me. "Okay," she said quietly. "When you're ready." After we hung up, I felt lighter. Not because the conversation had resolved anything, but because I hadn't bent. I hadn't rushed to reassure her at the cost of my own clarity. The next call came from my mother. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "Claire," she said, her voice softer than I remembered. "Your father and I have been talking. We had no idea." "I know," I said. "We would have supported you," she insisted, "if we had known." I closed my eyes briefly. "That's the thing," I said. "You didn't know because you never asked." She inhaled sharply, like the truth had taken her by surprise. We thought we were giving you space. Space isn't the same as interest, I said. She was quiet for a long moment. Can we come see you? She asked. We'd like to understand. I considered the question carefully. Not right now, I said. Her voice wavered. Why? Because understanding can't start with guilt, I replied. And that's where you are. She didn't deny it. After the call ended, I sat with the feeling that followed. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't bitterness. It was something steadier. I was finally choosing myself without explaining why. Throughout the day, the pattern repeated. Messages asking to meet. Calls offering apologies layered with justifications. Each one was different, but the core was the same. They wanted access. They wanted reassurance that the balance they were used to hadn't changed too much. I didn't give it to them. That afternoon I went into work. The normalcy of it felt intentional, grounding. Staff greeted me the way they always did. Meetings unfolded as planned. Decisions were made efficiently, without emotion attached. No one there treated me differently. No one tiptoed around me. I realized how rare that was. How valuable. During a break, my assistant asked if everything was okay. She had noticed the calls. Yes, I said. And this time, it felt complete. Late in the afternoon, my sister's fiancé tried to reach me. I recognized the number and let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. I imagined him pacing, rehearsing an apology that centered his discomfort more than his behavior. I wasn't interested. That evening, my parents sent a message together. They asked for dinner, neutral ground, a chance to talk things through. They used words like family and healing and moving forward. I read the message once, then set the phone down. I understood what they wanted. They wanted to reset. To smooth over the discomfort and return to something familiar, where roles were clear and expectations unchallenged. I wasn't going back there. I typed a short reply. Not today. I need some time. I'll reach out when I'm ready. There was no argument after that, no follow-up, just silence. And in that silence, something important happened. I realized how often, in the past, I had rushed to close gaps that others were comfortable leaving open. How often I had been the one to soften edges, to reassure, to make things easier for everyone else. Setting boundaries felt uncomfortable, not because it was wrong, but because it was new. The discomfort didn't mean I was being cruel. It meant I was being honest. That night, I took a walk through my neighborhood. The air was cool, the streets familiar. I passed buildings I owned, spaces I had poured years into without fanfare. No one here knew about the engagement party. No one here cared. And that was exactly how I wanted it. I thought about all the things I could do if I wanted to. All the power I now held without having to claim it. I could influence contracts. I could complicate careers. I could make people feel small the way they had tried to make me feel. I didn't want to. Revenge required emotional investment. It required me to stay connected to their approval, their regret, their fear. I had spent too much of my life doing that already. What I wanted was distance, clarity, a life that didn't require constant explanation. Back home, I poured a glass of water and sat at the table reviewing my calendar for the week ahead. Meetings, site visits, normal things. The future looked steady, unchanged by the drama I had just walked through. My phone buzzed again. A message from my sister. Just 3 words. I understand now. I stared at it for a moment, then put the phone face down. Understanding didn't require immediate forgiveness. Growth didn't require my participation. As the night settled in, I felt something shift fully into place. The respect they were offering now came too late to feel meaningful. It wasn't rooted in knowing me. It was rooted in realizing they had underestimated me. That wasn't the kind of respect I wanted. What I wanted was to protect the life I had built. To keep it from being reshaped by people who had only just noticed it existed. Before going to bed, I wrote 1 sentence in my notebook, something I knew I would come back to again and again. Boundaries are not punishments. They are instructions. I turned off the light and lay in the dark, calm and resolved. Tomorrow would bring more conversations, more attempts at repair. I would face them when I chose to. For now, it was enough to know that I no longer had to prove anything. The moment they saw me clearly was the moment I stopped needing their validation. Respect that comes after revelation isn't a gift. It's a reminder of why the boundary matters. I didn't wake up angry anymore. That surprised me more than anything else. For years I had carried anger like a low-grade fever, something that flared whenever I thought about my family or the way I had been treated. After the engagement party, I expected it to come roaring back. Instead, there was only clarity. Clarity can be unsettling when you're used to noise. In the days that followed, I became acutely aware of how much power I actually held. Not the loud kind people brag about, but the quiet kind that comes from position, timing, and choice. I saw it in the way emails were suddenly phrased more carefully, in the way calls were returned faster, in the way people who had never bothered to learn my story now spoke as if they had always been on my side. It was tempting to test that power. I could have made a few phone calls and changed the trajectory of my sister's fiancé's career. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal. Just enough pressure applied in the right places to remind him that words have consequences. I knew exactly how contracts worked. I knew which partnerships were fragile. I knew how easily reputations could be quietly damaged. The thought crossed my mind more than once. I imagined him realizing, too late, that the woman he had dismissed as an inconvenience had the authority to make his life significantly more complicated. I imagined the look on his face if he understood how close he had come to losing everything because of a single whispered sentence. But when I followed that thought to its end, it didn't bring satisfaction. It brought exhaustion. I didn't want to spend my energy rearranging someone else's downfall. I had spent too many years building myself up to start measuring my worth by how effectively I could tear someone down. That realization felt like another kind of victory. I heard things indirectly, of course. News travels fast when people are uncomfortable. My sister called once to tell me that her fiancé had been on edge, that he was worried about work, that he kept asking if she thought I was angry enough to interfere. I listened without reacting. "He's scared," she said quietly, almost apologetically. "I know," I replied. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. There was a long pause on the line. "Nothing," she repeated. "Yes." She didn't understand at first. Most people wouldn't. We live in a world that equates power with action, control with response. Choosing not to act is often seen as weakness. But sometimes it's the opposite. The more he worried, the clearer it became that my silence was doing more than any confrontation could. He didn't know where he stood. He didn't know what I was capable of. And because of that, he had to sit with his own behavior without distraction. That was his reckoning, not mine. My parents, on the other hand, were struggling in a different way. Their discomfort wasn't rooted in fear of consequences. It was rooted in shame. They had begun replaying years of conversations, searching for moments where they might have missed something important. My mother left me a voicemail one evening, her voice trembling slightly. She talked about how proud she was of me now, how amazed she was by what I had built, how she wished she had known sooner. I listened to it once, then deleted it. Not out of cruelty, out of honesty. Pride that arrives only after proof is not the kind that heals old wounds. It doesn't erase years of being overlooked. It doesn't magically transform absence into presence. What my parents were feeling wasn't pride, it was regret. And regret, while understandable, is not a foundation for rebuilding trust. They wanted reassurance that things could go back to normal, that we could reset the relationship now that they finally saw me clearly. They didn't say it outright, but I could hear it in their words, in the way they spoke about moving forward without addressing the past. I wasn't interested in that version of peace. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to sit with the idea that I didn't owe anyone closure, that I didn't have to make things comfortable for people who had been comfortable while I struggled. That was harder than any confrontation would have been. I thought about all the moments when I had swallowed my feelings to keep the peace. All the times I had chosen silence because it seemed easier than being misunderstood. Back then, silence had been a survival strategy. Now, it was a choice. I returned fully to my work that week, throwing myself into projects that had nothing to do with family dynamics or social drama. Site visits, budget reviews, long-term planning. The things that had always grounded me. My team didn't tiptoe around me. They didn't ask questions. They treated me the same way they always had, and I realized how rare that was. In this space, my value had never been tied to comparison or assumption. It had been built through consistency. That consistency was what I trusted. One afternoon, as I sat in my office reviewing reports, my assistant mentioned casually that someone had called asking to speak with me directly. When I asked who, she hesitated. "It was your brother-in-law," she said. Or, soon-to-be. I nodded. "Did you tell him I wasn't available?" "Yes." "That's fine," I said. And it was. I didn't need to hear his apology. I didn't need to watch him try to justify himself. Whatever he wanted to say would be about easing his own discomfort, not acknowledging the harm he had caused. Sometimes the most meaningful consequence is being denied an audience. As the days passed, the urgency in everyone else's reactions began to fade. People settled into the new reality. The fear softened into caution. The shame dulled into something manageable. And I felt myself loosening too. I slept better. I focused more easily. The mental energy I had once spent anticipating judgment or defending my choices was suddenly free. I hadn't realized how much of my life had been shaped by the expectation of being underestimated. Without that weight, everything felt lighter. One evening, sitting alone in my living room, I thought about the concept of revenge and how misunderstood it is. Most people imagine revenge as an explosion, a public reckoning, a dramatic reversal of roles. But real revenge, the kind that lasts, is quieter. It's refusing to be pulled back into dynamics that diminish you. It's not explaining yourself to people who never listened. It's living so fully in your own integrity that other people's opinions lose their power. I hadn't won because I had more money. I had won because I no longer needed anyone's approval. The truth was, I could still help my family if I chose to. I could offer support, guidance, opportunities. Nothing about my boundaries required cruelty or abandonment. But help, I had learned, only works when it's paired with respect. Otherwise, it becomes another form of self-erasure. For now, I chose distance. Not permanent, not punitive, just enough to protect what I had built, both externally and internally. Late that night, my sister sent me a message. It was shorter than the others, stripped of explanations and emotion. "I'm trying to understand. I know it may take time." I read it twice, then set my phone down. Understanding is not a destination, it's a process. And it doesn't require my constant involvement. As I prepared for bed, I felt a deep sense of calm settle over me. Not the calm that comes from everything being resolved, but the calm that comes from knowing you are no longer obligated to resolve it all yourself. I had chosen what not to do. I had chosen not to punish, not to expose, not to humiliate in return. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. That choice felt powerful in a way nothing else ever had. Sometimes the strongest statement you can make is silence paired with a life that speaks for itself. And as I turned off the light, I knew that whatever happened next, it would happen on my terms. The last conversation I had with my family didn't happen around a table or over the phone. It happened quietly, weeks later, in the space where absence speaks louder than words. Life moved on. Predictably, efficiently. The world didn't pause for revelations or hurt feelings. Contracts still needed signatures. Properties still needed oversight. Guests still arrived with expectations and left with memories. My days returned to a rhythm that felt familiar, steady, and deeply mine. What changed wasn't my schedule, it was my posture toward the past. I no longer checked my phone with a tight chest. I no longer wondered how my words might be interpreted or whether my silence would be taken personally. I let messages come and go without urgency. I let conversations wait until they felt right. And slowly, something unexpected happened. The people who reached out began to change the way they spoke. My sister stopped apologizing and started asking real questions. Not about money, not about success. About how I had done it. About what it felt like to leave home at 19 and never look back. About whether it had been lonely. I answered some of those questions. Not all, not yet. My parents, for the first time, didn't ask for reassurance. They didn't ask when things would go back to normal. They asked what I needed. That was new. I told them the truth. I needed time. I needed space. I needed them to sit with the discomfort of realizing they hadn't known me as well as they thought. Not to punish them, to let the lesson settle. They didn't argue. As for my sister's husband, I never spoke to him again. Not because I was avoiding him, but because there was nothing left to say. He learned what he needed to learn without my involvement. His fear did the teaching for me. I heard, through quiet channels, that he became more careful at work. That he watched his words. That he asked more questions before making assumptions. Whether that change came from growth or fear didn't matter to me anymore. The consequence had landed. One afternoon, months later, I stood alone on the balcony of one of my properties, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The building hummed softly behind me, full of people enjoying a space they would never think twice about. I thought about how many versions of me had existed over the years. The girl who stayed quiet because it was easier. The young woman who left because staying would have meant disappearing. The builder who worked in silence because explaining herself felt pointless. The woman at the engagement party who stood still while others laughed. All of them had led here. I used to think revenge was about balance, about restoring something that had been taken. But standing there, I understood something more important. Nothing had been taken from me. Not my dignity, not my worth, not my future. Those things had been intact the whole time. Other people just hadn't noticed. The night of the engagement party would probably always be remembered by my family as the moment everything changed. The moment they realized the quiet one had been powerful all along. But for me, it was just confirmation. I had already built a life that didn't depend on their approval. Already learned how to walk into rooms without asking permission. Already understood that being underestimated can be a strange kind of freedom if you know who you are. The real transformation didn't happen when they saw me differently. It happened when I stopped needing them to. There is a particular peace that comes from that realization. A peace that doesn't need applause or recognition. A peace that allows you to set boundaries without anger and walk away without guilt. I didn't cut my family off. I didn't burn bridges. I simply stopped crossing oceans for people who wouldn't step across a street for me. And in doing so, I found something better than revenge. I found self-respect that didn't waver when rooms got loud or opinions got cruel. I found clarity that didn't dissolve under scrutiny. I found the quiet confidence of knowing exactly what I bring into a space, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. If there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that people don't always reveal who they are when they're comfortable. They reveal it when they think there will be no consequences. And the most powerful response isn't always to expose them. Sometimes it's to let them live with the echo of their own words. To anyone listening who has ever been mocked, overlooked, or dismissed because you didn't fit someone else's idea of success, remember this. You don't owe the world an explanation for your growth. You don't owe anyone a reveal. Build quietly, stand firmly, and when the truth comes out, let it speak for itself. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments. Don't forget to like this story and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories about strength, boundaries, and quiet justice. And if you're still listening, stay with us. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones where dignity wins without ever raising its voice.